for coming to the Treasure Coast History Festival. I'm Gregory Enns, the publisher of Indian River Magazine. This is the second year that we've had the festival. One of the things that people have told us about is that our history stories resonate most with them. The newcomers tell us that it gives them a great way to connect with their community and learn about their community. And the old-timers tell us, thanks for refreshing our memories. And so we saw that as one of our franchises, and one of the first people I went out to see when I started the magazine 12 years ago was the father of these gentlemen that we're going to talk to in just a few minutes, Bud Adams. And he told us, he's a famous nature photographer, and I grew up, and my family and his family goes back to pretty much the time that Judge Adams arrived in Fort Pierce in 1923. And so we had a long relationship, and Bud Adams told me, I'll do whatever I can for you. You can have my files, your photos, work with Robbie, and his photos always appeared in the magazine, every issue that we've ever published. And some of the most outstanding stories at the time, Bud said, I asked him if I want to do a story on you in the ranch. He goes, I'm really overexposed. Well, it took us about 7 or 8 years before he finally let us do a story on him. And it was one of the most popular stories. I couldn't even bring the magazine today because that issue was so popular. I do want to say, and I apologize for all of you having to wait out in the sun. We were having some technical difficulties. Robbie had some beautiful photos, but we had some technical difficulties, so we don't have it. However, many of those photos are in the Bud Adams Tribute Edition that we'll have available for you free as you leave today. In fact, Rachel, if you could bring one of those up to me, please. I have to sit my mother. Mom? Yes, this is the copy right here. So we have plenty of these, and our friends, the history students from Fort Pierce Central High School, will be giving them out. Just a quick announcement about the other programs that we'll have today. At 12:30, at 12 o'clock, we'll have a quick interview with the Summerlin family, the first family of fish fries. And many of the older Summerlins will be here to tell us about early fishing and history in Fort Pierce. And then at 1:30, we have a session on the site of Old Fort Pierce. It goes back thousands of years to the Ice Indian culture, and also it was a military fort. And that's just about a mile from here. And so you'll learn a lot about that. I see Harold Holtzberg in the audience. He lives down there. I don't think he wants too many cars down there, but you should definitely go down there and see that. But those are free, and those are at 12. And then at 12:30, we have the Zora Neale Hurston and Waldo Sexton musical produced by the students from Indian River Charter High School. And that's free, and that's based on letters that were recently discovered between Waldo Sexton and Zora Neale Hurston, including a manuscript that is of hers that has never been published. She's a famous writer who died in Fort Pierce, and she wrote "Their Eyes Were Watching God." So that'll be really interesting. And we're hoping that Chris Sexton, who found the letters, will be here. So I want to introduce to you the Adams brothers, Mike and Robbie.
Good morning. It's great to see so many friends, neighbors, even from Vero, so that's great.
Road goes both ways.
I know, sometimes. That's true, but anyway, I'm really just impressed with everybody here and seeing all of our good friends.
Also, I see a lot of faces I know, and some I don't know that know me, but I always say hi, and good to see everybody.
And that's Robbie. He just said to everybody, kept on calling him, "Hey, Mike." I said, we'll fix that today. So, the Adams family's history in Fort Pierce goes back to 1923, when, according to the fourth quarter.
That's right. That's when my grandfather finally wound up down here after going through law school, practicing law a little bit through the panhandle of Florida. And he kind of ventured out to see what else in the world offered. And of all things, he ended up in Fort Pierce. And he felt like Fort Pierce was the county seat and had a pretty thriving, county as far as having quite a few lawyers here. So he thought it fit in well here.
Back then, St. Lucie County, Vero Beach, and Stewart were included in St. Lucie. We're all part of St. Lucie County. So you'd want to live close to a courthouse if you're, especially if you were a lawyer, because you generate more business, I think, or it'd be easier.
Right, and he thought since he was fresh out of law school, he stood a little bit higher than the current lawyers here at the time. So he said the competition wasn't too high. So
tell us a little about that. Your grandfather came from Walton County, and he came from a farming family. And tell us a little bit about him and growing up. And what I'm always fascinated is about the grandfather, maybe it was your mother's father, though, the one who was feeding Coca-Colas to the bears standing up. That's one of my favorite photos.
I'll start with my grandmother. Her father was a woodsman. He hunted for a living, had a few cows, and wasn't really a farmer. And he trapped fish, trapped bears, and my grandmother hated the job of distracting the bear. And they get a loop around his neck while he's in a steel trap, and then she would go behind the bear and undo the trap. And so she didn't like that job, as you can tell. But he was an interesting character, and my dad loved to go visit him because they would hunt and fish all day. Unlike his grandfather on his father's side, he had the farm. His grandfather on his father's side, he was a Civil War orphan, and that was a war-torn area. People didn't have any money, and it was a terrible place. But he walked 50 miles to get a meal and to start his farm and homestead. And he used his kids to run the farm, and it was run like a military operation. And most kids didn't have any shoes. They had hookworms, extended bellies. It was a tough place.
So Judge Adams comes to Fort Pierce. He's got this, we call him, he wasn't a judge yet, of course. I'll say Alto Lee Adams Sr. comes to Fort Pierce in 1923. He checks the place out. And then he doesn't really know anybody, but he takes this very interesting case that didn't make him a lot of friends. So who wants to tell us about that?
The Ashley Gang. The Ashley Gang was a notorious gang. They kidnapped, bootlegged, stole cars, and they were. Nobody liked them. They were very dangerous. They tried to capture them several times, and police officers got killed. And so eventually, they caught them on a bridge and set up a trap for them, and they captured them, and they killed them. And the wives contended that they were handcuffed and executed. So they contacted my grandfather, and he was the only one that would to be their lawyer, because the other lawyers didn't want to handle that case. It's very unpopular. So my granddad had the bodies dug up, and they did find handcuff marks on their wrist, and it went to a judge, and judge defended it, and the judge tapped the gavel and said, "Justice has been served," and he lost the case.
Robbie, when you told us that, was that pretty much how your grandfather told the story to you?
Yes, I traveled in a car, and I heard stories that are a little bit different than other people say, and I believe my stories are a little more correct. And
What I like about spending time with Robbie is that he really remembers things. He's got an excellent memory of how things are and what his dad said, what his grandfather said, all of these guys. Lee is not here with us today. I asked who the best cowboy was, and I guess that goes to Lee. Mike said Lee is because he's not here today. So, Lee's the oldest brother. Mike is the middle brother, and Robbie's the youngest brother. And Mike is the president of Adams Ranch, and that's back in the 70s. You guys, you know, Bud Adams was doing succession planning, I guess, and you guys decided the brothers elected, at least this is what I read that your dad wrote, that you guys elected Mike, you and Lee elected Mike president, or?
that is correct.
Okay. There was, at the funeral of their dad, big gathering out at Adams Ranch when your dad died in late September. It was funny because it was a big line to see Mike. It was like the Godfather.
It was just raining and that.
So
we were under one roof, and it's pretty crowded. So I don't remember who I saw that day.
one of the other early cases that Alto Lee Adams Sr. handled, and I'll just mention that because we're in the Sunrise Theater, was back then Vero Beach. Our friend Mark Tripson is here, but Vero Beach was very liberal. So on Sundays, they allowed you to have movies at the movie theater. And while the Sunrise Theater, I believe it was Pop Kobelgard, because Judge Adams says this in his book, that Pop Kobelgard was going to have wanted to have movies here at the Sunrise on Sunday too. And so he even got, the first movie he tried to show was the Ten Commandments. And so it starts the Ten Commandments and they close it down. Well, Alto Lee Adams Sr. got that case too, and he won that case. And Fort Pierce has had movies on Sundays ever since.
He believed in less government.
A lot of things.
Tell us about marrying your grandmother, yes, your grandmother, and the birth of your dad and Elaine, and then up to like from 26 to 37.
You want to take it?
About your grandmother, yeah. Where he met her. And
My grandmother said that she married my granddad because that's the best deal she had. My grandmother knew my granddad growing up, and her parents said never marry an Adams, and she did anyway. They moved to an apartment house, and then they moved to Maravilla, which was a development on Sunrise and Oleander. And it was a booming development, and the hurricane hit, and it had a golf course and everything. The hurricane hit and took every leaf off the tree, and that was the bad hurricane of, I believe, 1928 that led to depression in Florida. And so anyway, they had a pretty good life. My granddad handled a lot of lawyer things on settling land cases, and then when the Depression hit, he went right back in and settled partnership breakups and bankruptcies, and he made money there too.
Okay, so we'll talk about, so he's a successful lawyer, and he's got a farming background, and then he gets an interest in cattle and this land. I think one of the first land deals he did when he was in Fort Pierce was he bought 80 acres for $1. Back then, and I'll have these guys explain it, but this was the land of the free range where cattle there were no barbed wire fences, there just weren't fences, and the land wasn't considered valuable, but he had bought the land for $1, and
Land was very, very valuable during the 20s, but that was 1933, and it was in bankruptcy, and he bought it for $1 an acre, and then a little bit after that he sold it for $20 an acre to the guy's brother, who was a Mr. Coates.
so, and what strikes me about this book too is that, I was looking for like a chronology, or, oh, I got this land and I got that land and I got this land early on. But what he really talked about was he got into the cattle business. People weren't really that concerned about buying the land, as they saw the commodity in the cattle. And so he started buying cattle in partnership with Thad Carlton.
That's true. That at that time, the cattle people, it was all free range across Florida, and even in Osceola County, which we do have some land now. There was actually some cases where the counties needed money, so they couldn't tax. Nobody owned the land particularly, and a lot of the landowners weren't paying their taxes anyway. So they went to the cattlemen because they had money, but they tried to tax them for their cows. So they put a cow tax out, and that caused a lot of issues with, trying to get a count on how many cows people have. So, people ask ranchers even today how many cows they have, and you get you don't get much of an answer. And one of Dad's best answers is he says, I've got enough cows to graze my grass. And then they ask him, well, how much grass do you have enough to feed my cows? So during that time, it was pretty interesting how that came. In Osceola County, they ended up shooting the sheriff over it. One of the cattlemen did, and then I think there was retribution with his family, and he ended up moving somewhere else, but taking his cows and going somewhere else. But that open range issue was really something that my grandfather had the foresight to see, that the land was going to be worth something someday, and that's why he really reached out and made that effort to acquire that land.
So basically, he bought land at where the current Adams Ranch is, and he started putting parcels together.
Somewhat. He bought a huge tract from a fellow investor from Iowa, and he was interested in buying some land from him, from what I understood. And he wrote him a letter, and got a letter back and said, well, I really, interested in selling the land, but I've got like 40,000 acres. And of course my granddad said, well, I don't have any cash. And through the conversation, I think my grandfather finally went out there and met with him, and he says, well, you look like an honest man. So they worked out a deal where part of the ranch was inside the drainage district and part of it was outside. And anyway, my granddad was able to sell the land inside the drainage district and to help pay for the land outside the drainage district. So that's how that kind of came to be. So it's kind of one of those great deals that you hear of, no money down.
Okay, so he's got starting a ranch out there, and one of the things I learned that in the fourth quarter, this book that their grandfather wrote, probably about 10 years before he died, is that I'm sorry. So he bought the ranch in 37, and he's appointed circuit judge just a year later, 1938. So he became a circuit judge, and then he was appointed to the Florida Supreme Court in 1940. So tell us about that. He was appointed to the Florida Supreme Court in 1940. Tell us about that.
You know, I guess before that, you know, he's always had great respect for people in agriculture. But at the same time, when it became time for him to take his 40 acres and a mule that his father offered, he went to the University of Florida instead. And so he really, while he had respect for him, that wasn't necessarily his vocation. So, you know, the law played a big part in his life and was his focus. And I don't know if you want to touch on some of his judgeship.
Well, going to school, he was a great debater, and he's very stern, and he intimidated the other speakers, and that helped him win cases. He's circuit judge in 1938, and during the war, he was appointed to the Civil War. I mean, in World War II, he was appointed to the Supreme Court. Sorry. He told me some interesting stories. He started his house in 1941, and they were not building any more houses during World War II, but he had his already, and he built a big house in Tallahassee. And he told me that a fighter plane shot his car parked in front of the Capitol building in Tallahassee where they were training. And I'll turn to Mike.
But, so he was a judge for 10 years, and I got the Main Street Fort Pierce every Halloween puts on a ghost story, a ghost walk, and they had me do Judge Adams standing at the Alto Lee Adams Senior Courthouse. And one of the things that they, you know, so I had to play the role of Judge Adams, but they called him, that he was so concise legally and had such a concise mind that they called him, and I'm happy to say that Judge Alderman, the former Florida Supreme Court Justice, is sitting right up here next to my mother. So I hope you'll talk to him after this. But anyway, they said that Judge Adams was the master of the one-pager opinion. So at 51, he runs for governor. Tell us about what he told you about that, and who else he was running against.
Right, at that time he ran for governor, and of course it was against the McCartys, which were here as well, so Dan McCarty. And I think he was kind of the third leg in that race, and so it really didn't work out very well for him, so it kind of soured him on politics. Even my dad, not much of a politician, that was enough for him to be in that kind of limelight. And so that's really kind of kept us out of the fray for the most part. But he really had some interesting times talking about traveling across the country, across the state. So it really opened his eyes to other opportunities, and that was probably one of the greatest things he had, was the vision, the vision to buy the land initially. Saw opportunities across the state. He owned a hotel in Winter Haven, and at one time, so he was invested in a lot of different things.
He had a car deal. Was he an ownership in a car dealership?
Right, he had ownership in car dealerships. He had partnerships in in the insurance business in Tallahassee with the Majets, and they were a close family that we've known for we've grown up with.
And he had a lot of different farming partnerships, and he had a lot of partnerships with the fabled cowboy agriculturalist Earl O'Bronson too.
Right, and and my dad spent some time with Earlo, but his close partnerships here were with the Scott family. They farmed all over, and they even farmed down into Mexico at one time. And Judge was part of that partnership, but he really worked well with people, all kinds of people, and communicated well with everybody. And that was one of his really strong attributes. It didn't matter who it was, but he could converse with anyone.
And he also, so he was retired from the Supreme Court and so forth, but he went back to the Supreme Court for a brief period in the 1960s.
Right.
Okay.
He was appointed by Claude Kirk in the early 70s.
Okay, and then he retired. He died in what year?
1989.
And he had a house out at the ranch, and he's got a beautiful library out at the ranch that he built. And he also, in his later years, he wrote this book. I'm sorry. It's called The Fourth Quarter. It's out of print, and I hope they have it at the library here.
The fourth quarter refers to his age. When he was 75, he wrote the fourth quarter, and he built the library about that same time.
I remember the character that wrote it was with him, Tom Duncan. He was quite a funny guy, but a lot of people remember him. He was a reporter at the News Tribune, and he had an interesting way about him. He's the only reporter I knew who had a rucksack with a reporter's notebook and a loaded .22 in it. Okay, so there's just one last question, burning question that I have. Judge Adams, what I remember as a kid, he had a Rolls Royce, and he would drive, between the ranch and when he had the house on the drive. So I got to ask you, did you ever get to drive the Rolls?
Yes, I did. He would pick out a date for me and say, "Here's the keys to the Rolls," and I don't think it impressed him at all.
Five?
No, everybody was impressed when they came out to the ranch and they could get in his Rolls, and he'd take him out through the ranch and bounce around. So the poor dealership down there in Palm Beach would come up, and they were just disgusted. It was mud. It had mud on it. He didn't have somebody out there polishing it every day. It was Palm Beach Motors was just they just shake their head when they came up.
He would take me out, and I'd shoot a few hogs. We'd put down newspaper and throw it in the back.
Okay. Thanks, that's a great one. Okay, so let's move on to your dad, who's much revered, much loved. You just tell us about his early years growing up in Fort Pierce.
My dad?
Yeah, Bud Adams.
Well, Fort Pierce was small then, and he had a group. I think Harold Wilsberg here can tell you about it. But anyway, they had a group, and I've got pictures of birthday parties, and they became the elite of the Fort Pierce. And he told me about the theater, and he said the girls in Okeechobee were much prettier than the Fort Pierce girls because they didn't have sandfly bites all over them.
Okay, so what I read was in the fourth quarter was that part of the interest in agriculture and your grandfather's transition to cattle was, I think he bought 7 horses in North Carolina for the family could go riding, and then they started purchasing the cattle. with Thad Carlton and got interested in that. But was he doing, before the ranch started being purchased in 37, was he pretty much a city boy?
Somewhat, but,
I mean, you can't really imagine Bud Adams as ever being a city boy. But
yeah, he
was
loved horses,
Uh-huh.
as well as my grandmother and my grandfather. And Thad Carlton was Judge's partner, and they would go out to their ranch and ride. And that started an interest, but through the Carltons, he saw what ranchers were doing, and he was interested in fencing the land in.
And so 1937, they buy the ranch, and your dad really fell in love with it. And just kind of tell us what kind of world it opened to him. Also tell us about one of the earliest people that he remembers was the Seminole Polly Parker.
He told me this a year ago. He said when they started the ranch, they were cutting down cypress trees, and he was driving the wagon to the fence builders, and they were building the fence, and my grandfather would drive him around, and there was some Indian villages on the ranch, and that's where he met a lady that was Polly Parker, and they called her Aunt Polly. And my grandfather would carry her food, and sometimes she'd be there all alone, and other times they'd have 10 or so Indians there. And another story I heard from my grandfather, I don't know if he told anybody else, but his plan for the ranch was to buy it at $1 an acre and sell it for $2 an acre. And but after my dad went to school in Tallahassee and then University of Florida when my granddad was on the Supreme Court, and my granddad called him up when he was in the Navy, and he said, I sold, I think it was 20,000 acres on the north side of Orange Avenue, and he says, I'm going to sell the rest, I got a good deal. And my dad said, when I get out of college, I want to run the ranch. So he kept that land. And my dad was very good in mathematics. My grandmother was very strict in education. And my grandfather said numbers never lie. So he went to Emory and Chapel Hill, sent by the Navy to work on thermodynamics and really complicated mathematics. And he said he didn't know at the time. They were working on crunching numbers for the nuclear program and to bomb Japan.
And just reading some of your dad's books when he was a young guy, becoming a cattleman, and it sounded like maybe your grandfather had something to do with it. But your dad actually spent a lot of time with Earl Bronson, just kind of learning the cattle business. And so tell us about that.
He worked with Earl Bronson. He bought cattle from us, and at one time, and then my dad would spend the summers working for Earl Bronson. That's probably where he learned horseman skill, ranch management, and how Earl ran the ranch. He would go, and the cowboys would watch Earl. If he saddled his horse, you hurry up and get your saddled up because you're going to get left behind. And they would go out and round up cows or brand or whatever they needed to be done. But Earl was very influential, and when my dad was very, very young, he was elected to the president of the Cattlemen Association, and Earl was one of his mentors, and they did two interesting things. They got money to eradicate the screwworm population by releasing male sterile flies, and also the Greenbelt Law, and which helped lower the taxes for agriculture.
And you mentioned that he's the youngest person elected at the time to the Florida Cattlemen's Association. The saddle that we have here today?
Yes, that was given to him by the Cattlemen's Association for serving. And on the back it has a brass plaque, and it has his name and details on that.
And then he was still at the University of Florida, where he met what he always called the prettiest girl at FSU, and that was your mother. Tell us about that.
Something interesting about that was my mom's father would not let her see cowboy movies and said never marry a cowboy. But my dad was going to the University of Florida. My mom was at FSU. I'll let Mike finish.
Mike went to University of Florida. It's like a fair when I said.
Yeah, that's right. But no, it was, of course, that was the girls' school, and UF was the boys' school at the time, so that was the only place you could find girls in Gainesville that weren't spoiled. As Dad would said, we're spoiled rotten. So he went to FSU, and they were having a parade, I think, and she was on the float throwing out oranges, and she threw him one. So that was kind of how it started. And so be careful where you throw things. So.
The other thing, you know, you hear a lot about his dad, but his mom was really interesting because when they married and he decided to come back to the ranch, like you said, she had this very active social life, and she came back she didn't have any neighbors really for 20 miles or so, and you know, she made friends with the Seminoles. You know, those were her next door neighbors. But tell us about, you know, your mom.
You know, she, of course, being in the cattle business, Dad would be gone all day and work pushing cows or whatever and checking on things, and Mother would be at home taking care of 3 knotheads, and and you know, the Seminoles they're really different. They would show up sometimes, you know, and of course back then most people just dropped in on you anyway. But Seminoles might show up in the morning, and you know, Mother would say, well, you know, Bud will be home tonight. So they'll sit there all day, and they were always, you know, they were always trading dogs and whatnot. Dad had good cow dogs, and so that was a kind of an interesting relationship. And you know, I remember some of the Indian women coming in the house growing up, and they were all dressed in full-length dresses, highly ornate, and they would sit, and Mother would give them tea or something.
And your mom was the daughter of Pete Snively?
That's right.
Okay.
And from the Snively family in Winter Haven, and they were citrus people, and they started Lake Hamilton Citrus, had the largest packing house in the world at one time, and later on it merged into became Orange Co., a big citrus company. But anyway, the citrus industry's having its time right now.
But they also owned the land where Cypress Gardens was, and your mom was at Cypress Gardens Belle?
That was some of the family, right. I think that was an uncle, I believe, that had the Cypress Gardens itself. But they were a big family. She was from a family of 11 kids, so we've got lots of Snively relatives.
And then your dad developed this breed of cows called the Brayford, but tell us how that came about.
You know, I guess we needed cattle that performed here in Florida, and so we started with cracker cattle because those survived here. Brahman cattle were introduced in the 30s, and again, they were heat-tolerant type cattle, short-haired, did well here. But their meat characteristics, you know, were somewhat lacking. So Dad brought some Hereford cattle in from Kansas, CK Ranch and other ranches out that way. And they would load them on trains. They'd come to Fort Pierce, and they would put them out there to breed. And about half of them would die the first year through anaplasmosis and other things weren't vaccinated for, because they were basically foreign type cattle, so they did not thrive very well as far as the straight bred Herefords. So the first cross cattle were half Brayford and half Brahman. they still had a little bit of a crest hump, so they were discriminated against in the marketplace. So through a couple different crosses, he was able to come up with roughly a 5/8 Hereford, 3/8 Brahman animal. The cattle were straight backed, and so they weren't discriminated against in the marketplace, and had good market, carcass characteristics. And more importantly, they thrived in Florida. So after about 3 generations of Brayford to Brayford breeding, they are recognized by the USDA as a breed. So really they're the first breed that was bred east of the Mississippi for kind of our southeastern environment. So and so they're really the basis of our herd now, even though we've added some different breeding to our cattle now.
And they're also red. Your dad had a thing with cattle being red, and also with horses being red. And all the horses at the ranch are red too, right?
Right, they are. And your red cattle reflect heat more so, of course, than your black cattle, and some of your other colors as well. So that really is a heat characteristics that's important for us here in Florida.
So he's got some cattle. He's in the forefront of the cattle business. But the interesting thing that you might know about Adams Ranch that you'll know today is it's just not one ranch. It's your dad and your grandfather were purchasing other ranches, and the family were purchasing other ranches. And tell us what Adams Ranch Inc. consists of today.
Well, today it's roughly about 40,000 acres, and about 14,000 here, 24,000 in Osceola County, a little bit in Okeechobee County, in Madison County, and Georgia. So we're kind of gives us a broad spectrum. At least it's raining someplace.
But tell us how each of the ranches is used, or is each used for a different purpose or a different stage?
Somewhat. Our Fort Pierce Ranch is being the home ranch and home of the Brayfords. So that's always, and of course it's been Dad's lifelong passion is cattle breeding. So we've it's always been the seed stock operation of the ranch. So that's where our Brayford cattle, we've kept all our registration papers and records on our cattle in Fort Pierce. And from our Brayfords, we've gone from that to what we call the A beef, which are half Brayford, quarter Red Angus, and a quarter Geltby, just to gain a little bit more in carcass characteristics and be more palatable. The Osceola County Ranch is more of just a commercial cow-calf operation focus. And
explain what cow-calf is.
And cow-calf is just, you have brood cows and you breed them, and your calves are for sale. So, and you sell most of them to the beef industry. And some of the heifers will go back into replacements up there as well. But that's essentially what a cow-calf operation boils down to. North Florida is the same way as cow-calf. And then south of Augusta, we have a cow-calf operation up there, but it's focused on Red Angus. So we breed some of our own Red Angus cattle. And so we can kind of select cattle with, most of your Red Angus have long, northern environment. They have longer hair, not quite as heat adapted. So we're looking for little different traits in our operation in Georgia. So they'll transition better to South Florida.
So let's talk about life growing up at the ranch. What was it like, and then going to school? Just give us a general impression.
Yeah, we rode the bus, and Lee's older than I am. He's 7 years older, but he rode the bus with the Indians. And basically, me and Mike got up, and we went to the barn, and we'd have help getting it saddled. But Mike and we rode really big horses. Mine was Redbird, and they were, I believe, appendix. They were thoroughbred and quarter horse, or big quarter horses, I can't remember. Mike rode Big Earl, and anyway, they were runaways. It's a wonder we ever survived. But we rode horses all day, and we brought cows in usually, and then when me and Mike, we would drive calves into the pen to be branded, and when we were big enough, and pretty much what it was. We worked in the summer, went to school in the wintertime, and it was really hot and mosquito-y and tough.
And you didn't have very many visitors out there, because one of your cousins is here today, Mark. But I remember you telling they would, his cousins lived in Miami, and they would fly in, and their house is how far from yours?
3 miles.
No, it's just a.
Robbie said it was 3, but Mike says it's 1.5 miles. But tell us what you would do when you heard they were coming.
Well, yeah, when the airplane would fly over, sometime if I didn't have anybody to drive me, I would run over there on foot, and the youngest one, my cousin Peter, we were good friends, and Mark and Pat and Nat, they were always doing something very interesting, and so anyway, that was very different from the people we knew.
But the ranch was really your playground, and one of the things that strikes me is that you found a lot of, there's not only is there prehistory with the Ice Indian culture out there, but there's also a lot of early settlers. There were actually a couple of settlers, the Gammons, and then the Alderman's, Judge Alderman's grandfather's brother had a place out there too. And you guys would explore those places.
Yes, we did. We looked for bottles and things like that, but there was probably the early Indians before the A's, or they developed into the A's. My stepson found a spearhead that we believe is 6,000 years old. And so the A's, they built Indian mounds everywhere. And the Seminoles moved in. They didn't have to build Indian mounds because they were already built. And then the settlers, they put houses on top of on top of the Indian mounds, and it would keep them from flooding. And there was the Aldermans, and they came out and built a pretty good-sized grove in the 1880s or 90s, and then later the Gammons, which the wife was Averill, they moved in and they built a homestead on top of a Indian mound as well. And they built a grove, and my granddad bought the grove from the Averills. It's actually a pretty good sized piece of land, and I think he got on a. Mike already touched on that. My granddad got on a Ford triplane and flew all the way, I think it was Illinois, to discuss the purchase, and he bought the land. And but we like going there, look at bottles, and there was a few things.
One of the things your dad found was, tell him about the canoe.
When my dad was a boy, he found a canoe in a swamp, and when we were little kids, we moved it to the yard, and now we moved it to the museum. But I built a copy of it out of a solid piece of cypress, and we have it in our little family museum at the ranch.
The other thing you were mentioning, the hammocks out there and so forth. But Florida, and we'll talk about this at 1:32, Florida was 200,000 years, well, I'm not going to use the figure because somebody will correct me, but Florida was underwater, and the reefs, where there are hammocks, there are reefs, where the reefs were.
Yeah, all of Florida was underwater except for the ridge, what we call the ridge today, and very shallow, and there was tides that moved in and out, and this developed coral reefs, and now that's where all your hammock land, oaks and palm trees, they grow on that rock. And then when there was no rock, there were just seashells where the beach once was. The Ice Age changed everything. The Ice Age tied up in glaciers so much water that the seas, they say, dropped about 300 feet. And the Ice Age started about 2 million years ago, and it was started declining 500,000 years ago, and it's pretty much over 11,000 years ago. But in Florida, you can find woolly mammoth, all your ancient, not ancient, but prehistoric animals like that, saber-toothed cats. Even in the bottom of the Indian River, that's the best place to find things like that.
Just because we're running out of time, I'm going to try to speed things up here, but tell us quickly how you guys decided how you each developed your own interest in the ranch or areas of specialization, and how you made the decision to stay on the ranch. None of the three brothers left the ranch, as far as I know. Did you guys?
No, we haven't left the ranch. And it's, it was growing up on the ranch, and, it was a neat environment. We worked there growing up as kids. We'd spend our summers working cattle with the cowboys. It was kind of a wild time as a cowboy growing up. You're working with grown men. You're treated that way, and you get off in the afternoon and go hunt hogs and put them in Rolls Royce. But it was a neat way of life, and I did go off to college, and one of the big things when I came back was we were kind of overrun by hogs, and so we work cows all day, shoot hogs in the night, and we were, of course, brought up to, you eat whatever you kill. So, I'd be up at 11 o'clock still cleaning up all the the hogs and whatnot, and getting them packaged and whatnot. But it's just a neat way of life, and that was something that I think Dad fostered in all of us to kind of enjoy the land. And it was his grandfather Williams that he got a love for hunting and being in the woods. And we also had some great friends that we grew up together hunting, the Colbegards, the Moores, and we've had some really great times together.
And so now let's move on to and you raised all your kids on the ranch, and there's a new generation of. Tell us who's working on the ranch today.
Right. Between me and Lee, my oldest son is working on the ranch, and his oldest son and daughter is coming back to the ranch, and Rob's got two of his.
Yeah, Sam's here, I believe. If you don't stand up, he's one of our. Yeah.
Sam's a great photographer, third generation photographer. We had a great photo by Sam in the magazine. In this issue that you'll see, it's a cowboy riding on the horse at sunrise.
That's right. He's got a lot of potential in photography and a good sense of art. But anyway, Sam and his brother Stuart, they're the main workforce on the Fort Pierce Ranch. So a lot of times you just see two cowboys rounding up quite a few cows.
Wow. Two cowboys and how many dogs?
They're not using dogs right now, but at the Lake Marion Ranch they use dogs. The pastures are very big and the cows are very wild. And the cows see the dogs and they helps them bunch up, get a sense of herding, which they are herd animals anyway, but younger ones don't realize that and they run out.
So Mike explained the cow-calf operation, and safe to say up until about 5 years ago, Adams Ranch Inc. was mostly a cow-calf operation. But recently, in the last 5 years, you've transitioned to...
I guess we are transitioning from just strictly a cow-calf op. Well, we've transitioned, I guess, over the whole length the ranch was started. And part of that is, my dad, my grandfather, they were both not status quo type people. They always were looking down the road and how things are going to change, and which kind of led us to the Brayfords and creating the Brayford Association and creating a Brayford breed. And as far as the cattle end of things, ultimately, it's the consumer that decides, whether you stay in business or not. So you've got to produce a product that fits the market. And so we've changed in the 90s. We changed our cattle a little bit, added some Red Angus and Geltby breeding to our Brayfords. They hit the market a little bit better as far as their carcass characteristics. So that gave us and we started retaining some ownership in feedlots out west, and trying to to really understand where we kind of fit in the marketplace. And then in the 2000s we started working into producing enough of them where we could do something else with them. So and probably about 5 years ago we were starting to consider the possibility of creating producing our own beef. And Florida had a dozen processing plants 50 years ago. When we started this operation, this focus, there was just one left. And and we found a gentleman in Chiefland that was able to grow cattle out. We're willing to do them with no antibiotics and no hormones. So that fit our, kind of our mindset. We've always felt cattle were something that you should be able to raise naturally without a lot of outside chemicals or anything else. And we were able to produce them. We started shipping them to Central Beef, and about a year later they shut down. So strangely enough, there was another gentleman from Canada that was creating a grass-fed operation. Built his own processing plant in Fort McCoy, Florida, not too far away from Chiefland. And we've been able to kind of piggyback with that operation, have our cattle processed there in a really modern type facility. They do a great job. And about that time, Lee had a contact with Whole Foods, and we met with Whole Foods. They said, this is exactly what we want for, local grown beef, hormone-free, pasture-based program. And still being grain finished, but they do require that you hit, some choice standards in their program. And so that has worked out really well. Most people, they'll say, we'll build a market for your cattle, but we won't give you a premium. You'll earn your premium down the road. Well, Whole Foods stepped up and said, we'll give you a premium up front to help you get started. And that has really helped kind of bridge that gap. So they've been a great partner.
Yeah, in other words, for years, you guys probably went to Publix to buy your beef, right? Or did you get?
That's right. Or Winn-Dixie, the beef people.
Yeah,
so.
because with the cow-calf operation, the calves were going to Midwestern stockyards or to the Midwest, and then where they would be fed and so forth.
Right. Growing up on the ranch, that was something that we did in the fall. When you start having, or winter when we have a cool day, was we would take maybe a barren cow that was fat. She was not too old, and we would process her at the ranch, and we would hang her up in our equipment barn, real sanitary conditions, quarter her up, and throw the quarters in the back of a pickup truck on some cabbage fans, haul it to Leonard's Meats, and have it processed. And that was some of the meat that we were raised on.
Okay, so it's called Adams Ranch Natural Beef.
That's right, and we've started our own Adams Ranch Natural Beef.
And you can buy it?
You can buy it at Nelson's or at Whole Foods through Florida.
Okay, so you can buy actual beef raised here?
That's right.
St. Lucie Ranch.
Yeah.
Okay, and then tell us about, there's another step, and we'll mention that your niece, Leanne, Lee's daughter, is the corporate secretary for the ranch?
That's correct.
Adams Ranch Inc.
Yes.
And she's also in charge of marketing, and she's spearheading the effort to with the Adams Ranch beef, and also you're doing it something across the street. Tell us all about that.
Sure.
Everybody wants to know about that.
Yes, yeah.
And Leanne is, she's been great as far as helping us with the marketing of our beef. Fortunately, she married into the Cheney Brothers family, so they know how to move product around, and they're a pretty amazing company. But so that does help. But I guess our newest venture is working with Gus Gutierrez, who owns the Galleria across the street. We have plans to open up what we call the Brayford, which will be a steak restaurant, and the other half of the building is going to be kind of a farm-to-table type setting. So you'll be able to get your, maybe high-end steaks in one place, and maybe more of your, steak dishes. It could be beef stew or something at the farm-to-table type setting. So it's going to be interesting. We hope to be in operation early next month. Of course, permitting.
Well, that's a real commitment to downtown Fort Pierce, both by your family and by Gus, and I hope that we all support it and do the best that we can to make sure that it's successful. I want to ask a few, let the audience ask a few questions. So if anybody's got any questions. First, though, before I forget, I want to make sure that all of you know that Indian River Magazine, as part of the celebration, we're giving out free subscriptions, 1-year subscriptions. So please make sure that you sign up for your free subscription at the Indian River Magazine table and tent at 2nd Street and Orange Avenue. So. If you want a question, if you'll just come to the edge.
Just a quick question. How many head of cattle do you have now, and how many acres?
We have a bunch.
Okay, when I was a young reporter, I would ask that, and the cowboys and the cattlemen would always tell me, "You never ask a cattleman how many head of cattle he has. It's like asking somebody how much money they have in the bank."
But we do, we understand people have those questions, but so we have about 7,500 mother cows on all our operations.
My dad always answered it. Yeah, he said if I knew how many cows I had, I wouldn't have very many cows.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I have a question. When I was a very young kid, I remember in the Fort Pierce Library reading the Judge's book. And my question today is, and I've tried to research it and find out where I can get a copy, and I'm wondering if y'all could ever possibly put it on Amazon Kindle, at least to download and make some money off of course, but I think that book would be very valuable to a lot of students and a lot of people considering the profession of law and also Florida history.
Yes, yes.
We'll sure consider that, yes, sir.
Mike and Robbie, Indian River.
We have a publisher there that
Right.
we can talk to.
We published 2 books, so see me.
I have a question. Maybe this is you already spoke about this, but do you have tours of the ranch?
We do have tours from time to time, and we generally work through like the Audubon Society or the Manatee Center, and through different groups, and we do it just as a just to help them as a fundraiser.
Oh, thank you.
Yep, and also the Sunrise Theater. They're having a cattleman's dance come up soon. What's the date?
On your ranches, do you have to deal with any kind of predators at all, or?
We do, and some of them drive up and down the highway, so, you know. But, you know, we have coyotes, which is something that we didn't have, you know, 20 years ago. They're kind of a new introduction, so they're a concern. Also, your black-headed vultures can be an issue because your cow will be trying to have a calf. And there are so many that come down from the north during the hard winters, and they've been attracted to our huge landfills that we have regional landfills around, and so they've become predatory.
But I do want to introduce, just mention a couple of people in case you want to talk to them. Most of them they've said it's okay to talk to them after. And I mentioned Judge Alderman, who's a former Florida Supreme Court Justice. Mark Tripson, who is the grandson of Waldo Sexton. Is the grandson of Waldo Sexton and son of John Tripson, who had the Tripson Dairies. So if you grew up, I know in Fort Pierce, I grew up on Tripson's Milk. And we also have Harold Holtzberg. And Harold is from the family, the first Jewish family in Fort Pierce, who was very instrumental in establishing a synagogue here and so forth. And they ran a grocery store, wonderful family, and so he's got a lot of stories to tell. Sandra Thurlow, a writer for Indian River Magazine and author of a lot of stories, especially authority on Martin County history. So thank you all for coming. Don't forget your free Indian River Magazine subscription. Make sure you sign up for that. The kids from the history classes at Fort Pierce Central will have the magazine for you as you leave. And our next show is at 12:30 with the Zora Neale Hurston and Waldo Sexton musical. And then at 12 o'clock we have the Summerlin Fish Fry. It's $12. The one last thing I would all ask you to do, my sister Mary is next to the Indian River Magazine tent, and we have a petition. Last year we had Edwin Binney, we had Sally Chapman talk about the Binney family. Edwin Binney was the guy who helped lead the effort to dredge the Fort Pierce Inlet and create the port of Fort Pierce. And he actually saved the bank that was located in the building across the street, the St. Lucie County Bank, by making a large deposit in the late 1920s, or in 1929. And so we're trying to get an effort to have a marker or something on the inlet or on the waterway to recognize his contributions, a more visible monument than the one that's there now. Last year we did something too. After last year's festival, we purchased a marker for the woman who was Lucia Zorish, who was a circus performer who spent her last years in Fort Pierce, and she had been laying in an unmarked grave for 75 years, and she was known during her career as the bravest woman in the world. So we gave the bravest woman in the world a marker, and it says the bravest woman in the world on the marker. Mayor Hudson's here, and she helped us do that. So thank you all for coming, and have a great day.